Imagine a river at the edge of a great field. Not a pleasant summer stream, alive with the chatter of birds and the soft green light of overhanging willows. No, imagine it at the raw and bleeding threshold of dawn, when the sky above the western hills of Ireland is the color of a bruise, when the mist comes low and cold off the water, and when the ground itself is still trembling with the memory of hoofbeats. Imagine the field beyond the bank, and do not look too closely at the dark shapes scattered across it. Do not count them. The air smells of iron and of something deeper, older, and more final than the word defeat can contain. And now look to the ford itself. Look to the shallow crossing where the water runs dark and fast between moss-covered stones. A figure is there, crouching at the bank. It is a woman, or it has the shape of one. She is washing something in the current, her pale arms working with a slow, methodical purpose that is utterly indifferent to the chaos and the carnage of the field behind her. What she washes is a cloak, or perhaps it is a shroud. The water that runs from it is the color of old rust. She does not look up as you approach, and yet you have the absolute and bone-deep certainty that she has always known you were coming. That she has, in some fundamental and terrifying sense, always known how this morning would end for you. Her hair is the black of a raven's wing. Her eyes, when she finally raises them from the water to fix upon you with a gaze of absolute and ancient knowledge, are the color of a stormlit sky. Neither gray nor green, but something older than either. She is not waiting for someone. She is announcing something. And what she announces, with the slow and unhurried patience of an entity for whom time is a concept too small and too simple to be a constraint, is the imminent end of a life, perhaps yours. The cloak she washes with such terrible industry is the burial cloth of a warrior. The warrior whose fate has already been decided. The warrior who does not yet know. The warrior who is, at this very moment, riding toward the ford with a heart full of courage and a soul full of hope, not yet understanding that the great and merciless machinery of fate has already rendered its verdict. She is the washer at the ford. She is the phantom queen. She is the great queen of night and battle and the terrible sovereignty of the land itself. She has a name that has echoed through the darkness of Celtic mythology for 3,000 years, a name spoken in whispers, a name that carries within it the weight of war and death, and the wild, ungovernable power of a world that was never meant to be tamed. She is the Morrigan, and she is nothing like what you have been told. In our contemporary cultural landscape, the Morrigan has enjoyed a remarkable renaissance. She appears on the covers of fantasy novels and in the lore of video games. She is invoked in online spiritual communities and rendered in elaborate tattoo designs. She has become a symbol of female power, of fierce independence, of the dark and potent energy of the sacred feminine. She is embraced by practitioners of modern paganism and Wicca as a patroness of warriors and a guardian of the vulnerable. She is presented as a goddess of sovereignty and transformation, a divine protector who stands with those who fight for justice. And there is truth in all of that. A fragment of truth, carefully selected and gently illuminated to make her approachable, meaningful, and safe. But safety is not the Morrigan's domain. She has never been safe. And the authentic, ancient, terrifying figure that lurks behind this modern reconstruction, the entity that our Irish ancestors understood with a mixture of awe and absolute dread, is something of an entirely different order. To discover her true visage, we must do what we always must when seeking the authentic face of any great mythological figure. We must strip away the comfortable modern interpretations, the reassuring contemporary frameworks, and the warm light of spiritual commerce. We must journey back into the darkness. We must enter the world of the oldest Irish texts, the great mythological cycles, and the epic sagas that were set down in writing by Christian monks between the 8th and 12th centuries, drawn from an oral tradition that reaches back into an age before history. We must travel back to the Iron Age of Ireland, to a world illuminated by firelight, to a world in which the gods had not yet retreated entirely from the affairs of humanity. And there, in the dark and turbulent heart of the mythological record, we will find her, not as a patron, not as a protector, but as the single most complex and frightening supernatural entity in the entire Celtic tradition, a being of such vast and alien power that even the greatest hero Ireland ever produced could not withstand her. This is her true history, and it begins not with a war, but with a name. Every journey into the authentic nature of the Morrigan must begin with a confrontation with language, because language, in the Celtic tradition, was not merely a means of communication. It was a technology of power. Words were not just symbols of things. In the ancient Irish world, words were the things themselves. A name was not a label attached to a being from the outside. It was a window into the essential nature of that being, a compressed mythology, a key to everything that entity was and represented. To know the true name of a thing was to hold a fragment of power over it. And to understand the true name of the Morrigan is to begin to comprehend the abyss. The name Morrigan is rendered in modern scholarship in several ways, and the debate surrounding its precise etymology is one of the most telling and significant arguments in all of Celtic studies. The most commonly cited translation is Phantom Queen or Great Queen, and both of these readings are supported by the ancient Irish language itself. The word more can be derived from an old Irish root suggesting greatness, vastness, and supreme authority. It can also be derived from a root connected to the concept of the phantom, the specter, the entity that is real and present, but which exists on a plane just adjacent to ordinary perception. Both meanings are simultaneously operative. Both are true at once. This is not a coincidence. This is the deliberate and profound ambiguity of a name that was constructed to hold multiple realities within it. She is the Great Queen in the sense of being the supreme sovereign of a specific and terrifying domain. She is the Phantom Queen in the sense of being an entity whose presence is perceived not through the ordinary senses, but through that cold electricity of the spine that the Irish called the dread knowledge. The understanding that something vast and inhuman was watching from a place just beyond the reach of your vision, what she is not. And this is perhaps the most important corrective in all of these discussions, is simple. She is not simply a war goddess, though war is her most visible domain. The contemporary tendency to categorize her as the Celtic goddess of war flattens her into something one-dimensional and therefore manageable. It places her in the same conceptual box as a divine warrior, a patron of armies, a divine general whose function is to inspire courage and ensure victory. That is not what she is. A patron of armies cares about the outcome of battles. The Morrigan does not care about the outcome of battles in the way that implies a preference for one side. She cares about the battle itself, about the raw and terrible power unleashed when human beings tear at one another, about the profound and cosmic function of death as a force of renewal and transformation in the world. She is not a goddess of victory. She is a goddess of fate. And fate, in the ancient Irish understanding, was not a comfortable concept. It was not the reassuring notion of a universe that tends toward justice, that rewards the virtuous and punishes the wicked. It was an inexorable and often arbitrary force, as indifferent to human suffering as the tide is indifferent to the sand castle it obliterates. The Morrigan is the personification of that force in its most absolute and uncompromising form. She is the divine manifestation of the reality that all things end, that all warriors fall, that all sovereignty eventually crumbles back into the land from which it was extracted. She is also not simply a triple goddess in the sense that popular modern spirituality has constructed that concept. The framework of maiden, mother, and crone, while useful in other contexts, is entirely inadequate for understanding her triadic nature. It imposes a human life cycle, a progression through biological stages, upon an entity that exists entirely outside of biological time. The three aspects of the Morrigan are not life stages. They are not phases of development or transformation in the human sense. They are simultaneous and distinct faces of a single terrible power, each one a different mode through which that power expresses itself in the world. They are the three faces of war itself, and each face is more terrifying than the last. To understand why she is the way she is, to understand the depth and the darkness of her mythological identity, we must understand the world from which she emerged. We must understand what battle meant to the ancient Irish, not in the modern abstracted sense of organized military conflict, but in the raw and visceral and sacred sense that the men and women of the Iron Age understood it. The Morrigan emerges from the same vast mythological substrate that produced all the great supernatural beings of the Irish tradition. She is of the Tuatha De Danann, that luminous and terrifying race of divine beings who we have already encountered as the old gods of Ireland, the tall and beautiful and impossibly powerful entities who ruled the island before the coming of mortal humanity. Her story is inseparable from theirs. Her character was shaped by the same cosmic drama that shaped the identities of the Dagda, the great father god, and of Lug, the shining master of all arts and skills. But within the Tuatha De Danann, she holds a position that is unique, one that sets her apart from her divine kin in the most fundamental way. Where the Dagda embodies abundance and paternal power, and where Lug embodies the brilliance and skill of divine creation, the Morrigan embodies something far more uncomfortable and far more necessary. She embodies the truth that the Irish mythological tradition was never allowed to forget, even in its most epic and triumphant moments. She embodies the fact that all greatness is temporary, that all light casts a shadow, that even the mightiest of the Tuatha De Danann would one day withdraw into the hollow hills, defeated not by a superior force, but by the inexorable turning of a cosmic wheel that even the gods could not slow. She is, in the most precise mythological sense, the divine face of what the Irish called Flaithias, the sacred concept of sovereignty over the land. And here, it is essential to understand that sovereignty in the ancient Celtic worldview was not merely a political concept. It was not simply the right to rule over a territory and its people. It was a profound mystical bond between a king or chieftain and the land itself, a bond that the land personified in the form of a powerful and often terrible goddess. The land was not passive. It was not simply a resource to be exploited or a territory to be claimed. It was a living entity with its own will and its own demands, and the right to rule it was not granted by popular consent or military conquest alone. It was granted by the land goddess herself through a sacred marriage, a mystical union between the masculine principle of human kingship and the feminine principle of the living earth. The Morrigan is one of the most powerful expressions of this sovereignty goddess tradition. And sovereignty in her hands is not a gentle or benevolent force. She grants it with the same cosmic indifference with which she withholds it. She elevates the worthy king and destroys the unworthy one. She stands at the border of human ambition and the wild, untamable power of the earth, and she enforces the fundamental law of the ancient Irish cosmos, that no individual, however mighty, however brilliant, however beloved, is greater than the land that sustains him, that all kings are mortal, that all heroes fall, that the earth endures. This is the conceptual ground from which the Morrigan grows. She is not merely a supernatural entity who happens to appear in stories about wars and battles. She is a fundamental principle of the Irish cosmos, given form and voice, and the terrible agency of a divine will. And to encounter her in the myths is not to encounter a character in the ordinary sense. It is to encounter a cosmic force that has chosen to make itself legible in the language of story. her first great appearance in the mythological record, places her at the very center of the most important conflict in Irish mythology. The Second Battle of Moytura, as it is known, was the decisive confrontation between the Tuatha De Danann and the Fomorians, the dark and monstrous race of beings who embodied primordial chaos and the destructive power of the untamed wild. It was a war for the very soul of Ireland, a conflict that would determine whether the ordered and brilliant civilization of the divine race would prevail over the forces of darkness and dissolution. And it was in the preparations for this war that the Morrigan made her most explicit statement about her nature. The great story tells us that on the eve of the battle, the Dagda himself, the father god of the Tuatha De Danann, encountered the Morrigan standing at the ford of a river, washing. This is the first appearance of the washer at the ford in the mythological record, and it is profoundly significant. She was not merely washing clothing. She was washing the accoutrements of war, the cloaks and weapons of the armies who were about to clash, an act that was simultaneously a preparation for battle and a prophetic statement about its outcome. The Dagda spoke with her, and what passed between them was one of the most extraordinary exchanges in the entire mythological corpus. She did not simply agree to support the Tuatha De Danann because they were the forces of order and civilization, and she was one of their own. She negotiated. She spoke to the Dagda from a position of absolute power, as an entity whose support was not guaranteed, but had to be earned. And she made clear that her involvement in the coming conflict would not be a matter of simple divine loyalty. She would enter the battle as herself, as the full force of her terrible nature, and the consequences of her intervention would shape the outcome not according to the wishes of the divine generals, but according to her own unfathomable will. And when she did enter the battle, the results were everything the myths promised they would be. The Morrigan flew over the field of combat in the form of a crow, her voice a cacophony of battle cries and prophecies. She poured confusion and terror into the hearts of the Fomori warriors. She drove the tide of battle with the force of her will, not by fighting as a warrior in the physical sense, but by wielding the psychological and spiritual power of a being who existed at the intersection of life and death, courage and fear, victory and destruction. The Fomori did not simply lose the battle. They were broken, scattered, and driven from Ireland by a force that transcended the physical conflict entirely. This is the Morrigan in her oldest and most essential function. Not a warrior who fights, a power that shapes the outcome of conflict from a place beyond the conflict itself. She is the invisible hand that turns the scale, the force that converts the momentum of a battle from one direction to another, not through the strength of her arms, but through the terrible weight of her divine will. And she does this because conflict, in the deepest understanding of the Irish mythological tradition, is not merely a physical event. It is a spiritual one, and the spiritual dimension of battle is her absolute domain, but the Morrigan's presence at the Second Battle of Moytura is not merely one of influence from a distance. The texts preserve something even more extraordinary, a ritual of enormous significance that takes place on the eve of the battle itself. What she and the Dagda enact at that river ford is understood by scholars of the Irish mythological tradition as a sacred union, a hieros gamos, or divine marriage, a ritual of such profound cosmological importance that its performance was understood to directly determine the outcome of the conflict that would follow. The hieros gamos was not unique to the Irish tradition. It appears across the ancient world, from the sacred marriages of Mesopotamian kingship ritual to the mystical unions of Greek mystery religion. But in the Irish context, it carries a specific and deeply Celtic meaning. Union between the Dagda and the Morrigan at the ford is the union between the male principle of divine power, of ordered civilization and sustained abundance, and the female principle of sovereign authority over the land. He comes to her. He must come to her. The sovereignty of the land is hers to give or withhold, and without her endorsement, without the blessing of the land through her divine person, even the greatest king of the gods cannot be certain of his right to rule or his capacity to prevail. This places the Morrigan in a position of extraordinary power within the divine hierarchy. She is not subordinate to the Dagda. She is not merely a consort or a support figure. She is the condition of his authority. She is the source from which the legitimacy of divine kingship must ultimately be drawn. And this arrangement mirrors the political theology of the ancient Celtic world with a precision that reveals just how deeply the mythology was entangled with the actual social and spiritual practices of the people who told these stories. The ancient Irish king did not simply inherit his throne. He was chosen by the land, and the land spoke through its divine embodiment. The ancient inauguration rites of Irish kingship included ceremonies that were, at their most archaic, understood as a form of symbolic marriage between the new king and the sovereignty goddess. He drank from the cup of sovereignty, a ritual whose deeper resonances pointed to the primal union at the ford. He was wed to the land, and the land, in this theological framework, was the Morrigan. This makes her relationship with Cuchulainn, which we will examine in depth, not merely a personal drama between a goddess and a hero. It makes it a story with profound political and cosmological implications. When Cuchulainn refuses the Morrigan's offer of love and sovereignty, he is not simply rejecting a divine admirer. He is refusing the mystical compact that makes heroic power legitimate and sustainable. He is attempting to be a king of his own story without the endorsement of the land. He is claiming a sovereignty that is not, in the deepest mythological sense, his to claim unilaterally. And the consequences of that refusal are not merely personal. They resonate outward through the entire mythological tradition, shaping the doom not just of one hero, but of an entire heroic age. To speak of the Morrigan as a singular being is already to simplify her beyond accuracy. The authentic mythological tradition consistently presents her not as a single entity, but as a triad, a composite being whose three aspects are simultaneously independent figures in their own right and facets of a single vast consciousness. This triadic nature is one of the most important and most consistently misunderstood features of her identity. Her three constituent aspects are most commonly identified as Bodibi, Matcha, and either Nemin or Anand, depending on which text one consults, and the variation itself is instructive. It tells us that the ancient storytellers understood her complexity to be resistant to a single definitive accounting, that the facets of her nature were not fixed coordinates, but living aspects of a power that exceeded any single frame of reference. Bodibi, pronounced roughly as Bov in the Old Irish, is the most immediately terrifying of the three. Her name carries meanings that include crow, scald crow, and hooded crow, the dark birds that gathered above ancient battlefields to feed upon the fallen. But Bodibi is not simply the crow. She is the battle crow, the supernatural embodiment of the battlefield itself, as a site of profound and terrible transformation. She is associated specifically with the psychic dimension of combat, with the panic and the frenzy and the dissolution of individual identity that occurs when a man surrenders himself entirely to the red chaos of close order fighting. To encounter Bodibi was to encounter the moment when courage becomes something indistinguishable from madness. She inspired battle frenzy in the warriors of favored armies, a supernatural ferocity that stripped them of fear and of pain and of the ordinary constraints of human psychology, transforming them into something temporarily closer to the inhuman. She was the living manifestation of what the Greeks called menos, the divine battle fury breathed into heroes by the gods. But where Greek battle fury was a gift, a divine endowment of temporary excellence, the frenzy of Bodibi was something darker and more ambiguous. It was a dissolution, a tearing away of the self, and the warrior who received it could not always find his way back. She was also the prophet of the battle. She flew above the field, her voice the harsh and grating cry of the crow, and her cries carried within them the knowledge of who would live and who would die. To hear Bodibi calling your name above the din of battle was to know, with a certainty that went beyond thought and into the bone, that you would not see the next dawn. She was the auditory face of fate itself, not a gentle or merciful announcement of the divine plan, a raw and terrible cry of the absolute. The prophetic function of Bodibi extended far beyond the individual battlefield. The tradition preserves something called the Bodibi's cry, or the battle crow's prophecy, a form of supernatural utterance that could shape the consciousness of entire armies and entire eras. After great battles, the crow spoke of what had passed and what was to come. The ancient texts preserve fragments of these prophecies, strange and disorienting passages that move between past and future with the freedom of an entity for whom time is not a linear sequence, but a simultaneous landscape. She has seen everything that will happen because she exists at a level of reality where all events are, in some sense, already complete. Her cry above the field is not a warning. It is a recitation of what is already written, already enacted in the deeper registers of the cosmos, now being made legible in the world of ordinary time and ordinary cause and effect. This prophetic dimension of Body Be's character connects her to one of the most important and most frequently misunderstood aspects of the Celtic supernatural tradition. The concept of fate not as a comfortable divine plan in which everything happens for a reason and all things tend toward a good outcome, but as an absolute and indifferent cosmic order that proceeds without regard for human preferences or human suffering. The Celts were not fatalists in the sense of being passive or despairing. Their great heroes faced impossible odds with extraordinary courage and ferocity. But they understood, in a way that the modern Western tradition has largely lost, that courage and action are not the same thing as control, that the outcome of events is shaped by forces that exceed individual agency, and that the proper response to this knowledge is not despair or passivity, but the fullest and most committed engagement with the demands of one's nature and one's situation, regardless of what the outcome will be. Body Be's prophecy is the voice of that understanding. She speaks from the place where outcomes are already determined, and she speaks to the warriors who are still in the process of living out those outcomes, not to rob them of the will to fight, but to free them from the illusion that fighting well will guarantee a particular result. The freedom she offers, the terrible freedom of the Celtic warrior tradition, is the freedom to act fully without the distortion of self-interested attachment to a specific outcome. Fight because it is your nature to fight. Fight because fighting is what the moment demands. Fight because the Morrigan is watching, and the crow will know the truth of what you were, regardless of whether you live or die. That is the only audience that matters. That is the only accounting that is final. Matcha is perhaps the most complex of the three, and the one whose mythology extends farthest beyond the confines of the battlefield. Her name is connected to the Irish word for plain or field, and she is deeply associated with the sacred land of Ulster, particularly the great royal site of Emain Matcha, the Fort of the Plain, which was the ceremonial center of Ulster's kingship. She is both a sovereignty goddess in the most explicit sense, a divine embodiment of the right to rule the land, and a figure of profound suffering and of the terrible consequences that follow when the sacred compact between king and land is violated. The myths of Matcha are among the most harrowing in the entire Irish tradition. In one of the most powerful of her stories, she is a supernatural woman who takes a mortal husband on the condition that he never reveals her true identity or her supernatural origins. When her husband, in a moment of foolish pride, reveals her to the king and forces her, heavily pregnant, to run against the king's horses in a race, she does so and wins, But the transgression of the sacred compact is too profound to go unanswered. As she crosses the finish line, she gives birth to twins, and her dying curse upon the men of Ulster is one of the most famous and consequential curses in all of mythology. For 9 generations, she declares, at the moment of Ulster's greatest need, its warriors shall be struck by a debilitating weakness that will leave them helpless, suffering as a woman in childbirth. This curse, the curse of Matcha, is the central narrative engine of the Ulster cycle, the great epic saga that contains the most important stories of Cuchulainn and his confrontations with the Morrigan. It is the invisible hand that shapes every conflict, every moment of crisis, every instance in which Ulster's survival hangs in the balance, and the burden of its defense falls upon a single, extraordinary, and ultimately doomed young man. Matcha is a sovereignty goddess who was wronged, and her vengeance reshapes the entire arc of the mythological tradition. She is not merely a figure of power. She is a figure of power that has been violated and has responded with a curse that will echo through centuries of story. Nemin, the third aspect of the Morrigan, whose name translates roughly as battle panic or frenzied one, is the least individually developed of the 3, but perhaps the most immediately experiential in her effects. She is the embodiment of the pure psychological terror of warfare, not the structured fear of the soldier who understands the odds he faces and makes his peace with them, but the irrational, overwhelming, paralyzing fear that strikes like a physical blow and reduces the most seasoned warrior to a trembling, weeping ruin. She is the divine personification of the moment when courage collapses entirely, when the body refuses all commands of the will, when the mind simply breaks under the weight of what it is being asked to endure. The old texts describe her raising her voice in battle, and the effect is instantaneous and absolute. Hundreds of warriors who had no wounds and no physical cause for collapse simply fall and die of pure terror. They are not killed by an enemy blade. They are killed by the sound of Nemin's voice, by the psychic annihilation of an entity that exists at the absolute limit of what the human nervous system can withstand. She is not a weapon. She is the weaponization of the most fundamental human fear, the fear that is older than language and older than thought, the fear of the abyss. These 3 aspects, understood together, give us a portrait of the Morrigan that is far more complete and far more disturbing than any singular description could provide. She is the battle crow above the field, and the panic that strikes the heart, and the sovereignty of the land that demands blood as its price. She is the prophecy of death, and the frenzy of survival, and the terrible justice of a cosmic order that does not accommodate human sentiment. And she is all of these things simultaneously, a being whose complexity is the very measure of her power. Of all the stories in the vast and labyrinthine mythology of the ancient Irish world, none illuminates the nature of the Morrigan more completely, more devastatingly, or more unforgettably than her relationship with the great hero Cuchulainn. This is the central story of her mythological presence. It is the story around which everything else in her tradition orbits, and it is a story of such profound and operatic tragedy that it has haunted the Celtic imagination for 2,000 years. Cu Chulainn, whose name means the Hound of Killing, was the supreme hero of the Ulster cycle, and by extension, the greatest individual warrior in the entire Irish mythological tradition. He was the son of the god Lug and a mortal woman, and his divine heritage manifested in abilities that exceeded ordinary human capacity in every conceivable dimension. He was faster than thought, stronger than storm, and possessed of a supernatural fighting ability called the Ryostrad, the warp spasm, a terrifying transformation that distorted his body into a monstrous and almost unrecognizable shape, his muscles convulsing and bulging beyond their natural limits, one eye sinking deep into his skull, while the other expanded to a terrible, staring globe, his heart hammering with a violence that could be heard from a distance, his entire being consumed by a battle frenzy so absolute that he could not distinguish friend from enemy. He was also young. He was beautiful. He was beloved by everyone who saw him. And he was, despite all of his supernatural gifts, profoundly and fatally human in the ways that mattered most. He was proud. He was stubborn. He was constitutionally incapable of backing down from a challenge or accepting help that came with conditions he found unacceptable. And it was these very human qualities, the qualities that made him heroic in the conventional sense, that made him utterly and catastrophically vulnerable to the Morrigan, their first significant encounter in the great saga of the Táin, Bocuilnge, the cattle raid of Cooley, is one of the most extraordinary scenes in all of Celtic literature. The Morrigan appears to Cu Chulainn not in her crow form, not as a terrifying supernatural entity announcing doom, but as a beautiful and regal young woman. She appears to him in the guise of a mortal princess, or at least in the guise of someone who could be mistaken for one, and she comes to him with an offer. She has watched him. She has witnessed the full spectrum of his extraordinary abilities, and she has been moved, if that word can be applied to an entity of her nature, by what she has seen. She offers him her love. She offers him her support in the coming conflict. She does not identify herself as the Morrigan, though the textual hints suggest strongly that a warrior of Cu Chulainn's stature and supernatural perception should have understood with whom he was speaking. She comes to him with the promise of something far more valuable than mere physical assistance. She comes with the offer of divine sovereignty, the blessing of the land itself, channeled through her divine nature, the mystical endorsement that would make his already extraordinary power something approaching invincible. And Cu Chulainn refuses her. He refuses her, and the manner of his refusal is as important as the refusal itself. He does not simply decline. He is dismissive. He is contemptuous. He tells her, in the language of the ancient text, that he has not the time to be dealing with a woman, that he has enough trouble defending Ulster without taking on the additional burden of a female attachment. He does not recognize her divine nature. Or worse, in some readings of the scene, he may recognize it and refuse anyway, which would make his arrogance not a failure of perception, but a failure of wisdom. He is in the middle of a war. He is alone, defending his province against the armies of Connaught, because all of Ulster's warriors are laid low by Match's curse. He does not have the patience for divine courtship, however profound and consequential its implications. There is a related episode preserved in a text known as the Tain Bo Regamna, the cattle raid of Regammon, that illuminates this first encounter from a different angle and reveals the Morrigan in an aspect that is even more explicitly ominous. In this tale, Cuchulainn encounters a strange and unsettling procession. A man and a woman are driving a cow along a road, and something about the scene strikes him as wrong, as charged with an energy that does not belong to the ordinary world of cattle and roads and ordinary journeys. The woman riding beside the cow is beautiful and dressed in red, and she speaks to Cuchulainn with a familiarity that is itself a form of warning, a familiarity that belongs to someone who knows you far better than you know them. He demands to know who she is, and she tells him with that patient, almost amused quality that characterizes her dealings with mortals who are beginning to understand something they cannot yet fully process, that she is a woman of sovereignty, that the cow is the cow of the other world, that she is driving it to a certain destiny, and that he should stand aside. Cuchulainn does not stand aside. He challenges her right to pass. He asserts his authority over the road. He is a great hero, and this is his province, and no woman with a mysterious cow, however strange and compelling, has the right to proceed without his permission. She responds with a statement that is simultaneously a warning, a prophecy, and a declaration of war. She tells him that at the moment of his greatest need in his next battle, she will come against him. She recites, with the calm and detailed specificity of someone reading from a text that has already been written, each of the forms she will take and each of the harms she will do him. She is not threatening him in the ordinary sense. She is telling him what will happen, as though it has already happened, as though the conversation they are having now is simply the formal notification of an event that is already complete in the deeper registers of reality. This episode clarifies something essential about the Morrigan that is often obscured in more casual treatments of her mythology. She does not oppose Cuchulainn because she hates him. She does not seek to destroy him out of wounded vanity or simple spite. She opposes him because he has, through his refusal and his arrogance and his inability to recognize and honor the sovereign power of the land that sustains him, placed himself in opposition to the natural order she embodies. He has claimed a kind of heroic independence that, in the Celtic mythological framework, is not simply foolish, but is a form of cosmic transgression. He is attempting to be complete in himself, to be a self-sufficient entity whose power derives from his own gifts and his own will alone. And the Morrigan's entire mythology is a systematic demonstration of why that is not possible. Why no hero, however extraordinary, is truly self-sufficient. why sovereignty must be acknowledged, courted, and honored rather than simply assumed. The Morrigan's response to this refusal is immediate, and it is total. She does not withdraw the offer and simply go away. She does not accept his dismissal with graceful resignation. She transforms before his eyes into the first of several shapes that demonstrate both the magnitude of what he has rejected and the scope of the retaliation he has now invited. And she tells him, with a clarity that admits no ambiguity, that she will come against him in battle, that where he needs help most, she will oppose him, that she will use the full range of her shape-shifting power to undermine, weaken, and humiliate him at his most vulnerable moments. This is the beginning of one of mythology's most complex and extraordinary antagonistic relationships. Because what follows is not a simple campaign of supernatural malice. What the Morrigan does to Cu Chulainn over the course of the Táin and the Ulster cycle more broadly is something far more interesting and far more philosophically significant than mere revenge. It is a testing. It is a process of revelation. She strips away every layer of his heroic identity with the systematic thoroughness of an entity that has no patience for the illusions by which heroes sustain themselves. She forces him to confront the absolute truth of his condition, that he is alone, that his abilities are finite, that the pride which defines his heroism is also the flaw that makes his ultimate defeat inevitable. She comes against him, as she promised, in battle. She approaches him in the form of a young heifer, a white red-eared cow of supernatural beauty, and she rushes at him while he is engaged in single combat with an enemy warrior. She tangles around his feet, disrupting his balance and his concentration. She bites him and harasses him. She creates the physical and psychic conditions for his defeat. Cu Chulainn, in his fury, wounds her. He strikes the cow, and in doing so, he wounds the Morrigan herself. She returns to him later in the form of an old woman milking that same wounded cow. She is partially blind in one eye, her leg is injured, her side is hurt. These are the wounds he gave her in the form of the heifer. And Cu Chulainn, who has now calmed from his battle fury, approaches her and accepts milk from her. He drinks, and with each swallow, he inadvertently blesses her wounds. He says a blessing over the milk as he drinks, an automatic act of courtesy rooted in ancient custom, and each blessing heals one of her wounds. He does not know what he is doing. He does not know who she is. By the time the milk is gone and all 3 blessings have been spoken, the Morrigan stands before him fully healed, and she is revealed. This scene is of the utmost mythological importance. It demonstrates something about the Morrigan that the simple war goddess framework entirely misses. She can be wounded, she can suffer, and she can be healed, though only inadvertently, only through the unconscious good will of the very man she is tormenting. It suggests a relationship of mutual entanglement that goes beyond antagonism into something far more complicated. She needs him in some sense that the text never fully articulates. He needs her, though he refuses to acknowledge it. They are bound together in a mythological compact that neither of them chose, and neither of them can escape. She comes against him again and again throughout the saga. She attacks him in the form of an eel that wraps itself around his legs in a river ford during single combat. She attacks him as a wolf that stampedes cattle toward him as he fights. Each time he wounds her. Each time she recovers. Each time the encounter deepens the invisible wound in his own story, the slowly widening fracture in the narrative of his invincibility. And then comes the encounter that is most often cited as the turning point in their relationship. After one of their confrontations, the Morrigan appears to Cu Chulainn in the guise of an old crone, a stooped and ancient woman sitting at the side of the road. She is milking a cow, and once again she offers him milk. This time, knowing in some part of himself who and what he is dealing with, he accepts with courtesy and with genuine gratitude. He blesses the woman. He blesses the milk, and the blessings complete their healing work. The Morrigan reveals herself, and for one strange and luminous moment in the mythology, there is something between them that is not quite peace, but is the closest thing to it that their story contains. She acknowledges his power. He acknowledges hers. It is the only moment in the entire mythology where Cu Chulainn and the Morrigan exist in something approaching equilibrium. And the student of myth who understands the Morrigan's nature will recognize what this moment represents. It is the moment when the hero and the sovereign power of the land are, however briefly, in right relationship with one another. It is the fulfillment, however incomplete and however temporary, of the divine compact that his initial refusal interrupted. And it illuminates, in the most poignant way, exactly what was lost when Cu Chulainn dismissed her offer of love and sovereignty at the beginning of their story. He could have had this. He could have had this and more permanently, unconditionally. Instead, he has a moment of ceasefire in the middle of a war that will ultimately destroy him. The mythology of Cu Chulainn builds toward its end with the inexorability of great tragic poetry. Every element of the Ulster cycle, from the curse of Matcha to the hero's refusal of the Morrigan's overtures, contributes to the accumulation of forces that will ultimately overwhelm even his extraordinary gifts. He is trapped, not by a superior enemy, not by a failure of skill or of courage, but by the combined weight of a universe that has been arranged through a series of choices and transgressions stretching back before his birth to end in his death. And the Morrigan is present for all of it. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the full weight of what the mythological tradition is describing. Cu Chulainn's doom is not simply the result of the Morrigan's opposition. It is the result of a systematic failure to maintain right relationship with the sovereign power of the land, a failure that began before his encounters with the Morrigan. And that is in some sense constitutive of his character, rather than merely the consequence of individual poor decisions. He was born to be the greatest warrior of his age. He was also born, the mythology suggests, with the specific and fatal incapacity to recognize that greatness without foundation in the approval of the land is brilliance without root, a magnificent structure built on shifting ground. The mythological tradition is deeply interested in the question of what makes heroism sustainable. It is not sufficient, in the Irish worldview, to simply be the best fighter in the world. To be a hero in the fullest sense is to embody the values of your culture, to stand in right relationship with the supernatural powers that sustain the world, and to act in a manner that is worthy of the land that produced you. Cu Chulainn is all of these things, and then he is suddenly not, at the precise moment when he dismisses the sovereign queen of the land as an irrelevance, as a distraction from the real business of being a great warrior. That moment is the seed of everything that follows. In the period before his final battle, the portents accumulate with a terrible poetic logic. Cu Chulainn is separated from the divine protection he might have had. The enchantments that sustain his power are systematically undermined. He breaks, one by one, the Jisa that are laid upon him, the sacred prohibitions that define the boundaries of his identity and his power. A jays in ancient Irish culture was not a mere taboo or superstition. It was a mystical boundary, a definition of the self through what the self must and must not do. To break a jays was to fracture the self, to become something less than what you were. And Cu Chulainn, trapped and manipulated by the forces arrayed against him, breaks his Jisa one after another. The breaking of his Jisa is not a simple sequence of bad luck. Each breach is engineered by the supernatural forces aligned against him, and each breach is made possible by the specific qualities of his character that have always been simultaneously his greatest strengths and his most fundamental vulnerabilities. His insistence on never refusing hospitality means he cannot refuse food from the 3 crones he encounters on the road to his final battle, even though he knows the food is a trap and that eating it will weaken him. His total commitment to the warrior's code of honor means he cannot refuse a challenge, even when the challenge is transparently designed to destroy him. He is not being destroyed from without. He is being destroyed from within by the very qualities that made him magnificent. The Morrigan appears in this final sequence as the washer at the ford. She is washing his weapons and his chariot trappings, the red stains flowing from them into the dark water. It is the most explicit prophecy in the mythology, the clearest and most unambiguous statement of what is to come. Cu Chulainn sees her and understands in the depths of his being what this vision means. He goes to his final battle knowing he will not return, and this foreknowledge, this absolute certainty of the outcome, is itself one of the most profound and most Irish aspects of his story. He does not go to his death in ignorance. He goes with open eyes, sustained by the only thing left to him that has not been stripped away: his willingness to face what cannot be avoided with the dignity of a man who knows who he is. There is in this final passage of the mythology something of extraordinary beauty, a kind of terrible grace that transcends tragedy entirely and enters the territory of the sacred. Cu Chulainn, in his final journey to battle, is stripped of everything. His divine horse mourns him. His charioteer weeps. The land itself seems to be in the early stages of a grief that will outlast the generations of men who will tell his story. He has nothing left but himself. No supernatural protection, no divine endorsement, no certainty of survival. He has only his own courage, his own identity, and his own absolute refusal to become something less than what he is in the face of what he knows is coming. And in this final stripping, this final reduction to the essential core of who he is, he achieves something that his earlier, more powerful, more protected self could not have achieved. He becomes, for the only time in his entire mythological life, fully and authentically himself. The armor of divine gifts and supernatural protection has been removed. The distortions of heroic pride have been burned away by the foreknowledge of his doom. What remains is the truth of Cu Chulainn, and it is magnificent. It is this final truth that the Morrigan has been working to reveal all along. Not to destroy him, to reveal him, to bring him, through the terrible instrument of his destruction, to the only form of self-knowledge that is genuinely free from illusion. His final battle is a masterpiece of accumulated catastrophe. His divine horse, the Black of Sangliu, refuses to be harnessed. The horse that has carried him through every previous conflict, the supernatural animal whose loyalty and power have been as much a part of his invincibility as his own skill, turns from him, weeping blood. Eventually it submits, but the omen is absolute. His charioteer weeps. Everything in the natural world seems to be mourning a death that has not yet occurred, but is already, in every meaningful sense, complete. He fights brilliantly. He fights with everything he has. But the Jisa are broken. The divine compact is unfulfilled. The sovereignty of the Morrigan has been refused, and the forces arrayed against him are sustained by a supernatural power that transcends the merely military. He takes his fatal wound, and mortally injured, he binds himself to a standing stone with his own belt, so that he will die on his feet, facing his enemies, rather than falling. He will not give them the satisfaction of seeing a great warrior crumple to the ground. He will die standing, and he does. The crow lands on his shoulder. It is only when the crow settles that his enemies know with certainty that he is dead. While the great warrior stood bound to the stone, even with his fatal wound, they were afraid to approach. He had been so completely and so terrifyingly alive for so long that death itself required confirmation. The crow on the shoulder of a dead hero is the Morrigan's signature, her mark upon the final scene, her authentication of the end of the greatest story in the Irish mythological tradition. But she does not simply sit in silence upon the shoulder of the fallen. The oldest accounts suggest something more, something darker and more complex. She has been there through all of it. She was the force that shaped the conditions of his death, the power that drove the wheels of his doom, the sovereign principle of the land that demanded his blood as the price of his refusal. and yet the nature of their final connection, as the crow settles upon the body of the greatest warrior who ever lived, is not one of simple triumph or simple hatred. It is something far more ancient and far more resonant than either of those human emotional categories can contain. She has watched him. She has tested him. She has broken him. And she has mourned him in the way that the Morrigan mourns, which is not with human tears and human grief, but with the terrible and ancient recognition that something extraordinary has left the world, that the brief and incandescent light of the greatest hero Ireland ever produced has been extinguished, and that the world, though it will endure without him, is diminished by his absence. There is, in this final image of the crow and the dead hero, a quality of mythological completion, of a vast and incomprehensible purpose fulfilled, that resists all simple moral interpretations. She is not the villain of this story. She is its necessity. She is the force without which the story would have no meaning. The darkness against which the light of Cu Chulainn blazed so brilliantly, so briefly, and so finally. Of all the forms that the Morrigan assumes in the mythology, none is more central to her identity, none more deeply embedded in the consciousness of the Celtic world than the crow. Specifically, the hooded crow, or the scald crow, the body be catha in the Old Irish, the battle crow, the dark bird that was as familiar a presence on the ancient Irish battlefield as the clash of iron and the cries of the wounded. The crow and the raven were not merely associated with death in the ancient Celtic imagination. They were understood to be its agents and its witnesses. They gathered above the field of battle in their hundreds, circling and crying, and their presence was both a prophecy and a judgment. A crow crying above a warrior's house was not a neutral, natural event. It was a communication from the supernatural world, a message from the Morrigan herself, delivered in the voice of the bird that was her most intimate physical avatar. This shape-shifting ability is one of the most theologically significant aspects of the Morrigan's identity. She does not merely adopt the crow as a symbol in the way that a saint might be depicted with an attribute, an eagle for vision, or a lamb for innocence. She becomes the crow. The boundary between the supernatural entity and the natural form is permeable, fluid, and meaningful in both directions. When the Morrigan is in crow form, she is fully and authentically the crow, possessed of its physical reality and its capacities. And when the crow wheels above the battlefield, it carries within it the full and terrible consciousness of the Phantom Queen. This represents a profound theological statement about the nature of the divine in the Celtic world. The gods are not separate from the natural world, observing it from a distance, and occasionally intervening in human affairs from a position of detached superiority. They are within the natural world, woven into its fabric, expressing themselves through its most powerful and most suggestive phenomena. The storm is not simply a meteorological event. The crow above the battlefield is not simply a scavenger attracted by the smell of blood. These are the visible physical manifestations of divine forces that are as real and as present as the wind and the rain. The crow was also, in the Celtic tradition, understood as a bird of extraordinarily long memory and extraordinary intelligence. There are scientific grounds for this attribution that the ancient Irish could not have known, but intuited through generations of observation. Crows are among the most cognitively sophisticated of all birds. They remember individual human faces. They solve complex problems. They use tools. They mourn their dead. They play. They are, in the community of animals, something genuinely uncanny. And the ancient Irish, who lived in intimate proximity with the natural world and observed its creatures with a careful and respectful attention that most modern people have entirely lost, recognized in the crow a quality of intelligence and presence that seemed to exceed the merely animal. The crow watched. The crow remembered. The crow returned. In the figure of the Morrigan as crow, all of these qualities are elevated to the cosmic scale. She watches all battles. She remembers all the warriors who have ever fallen. She returns to every field of conflict because battle is her domain and death is her necessity. And she is as permanent as the earth from which the blood is drunk and the bones are pressed. She is the continuity that persists through all the disruption, the ancient witness who has seen every empire rise and every empire fall, and who will still be circling, still calling, long after the last army has scattered to the winds. Role of the crow in the mythology of the Morrigan also illuminates one of her most fundamental functions, the selection of the slain. This concept has its most famous expression in the Norse tradition, where the Valkyries, the choosers of the slain, determine which warriors fall in battle and which survive to fight another day. But the Morrigan's role as a selector of the dead is older than the Norse tradition, and it operates according to a logic that is distinctly and powerfully Celtic in its implications. She does not simply observe who dies and who lives. She participates in the determination of that outcome through the exercise of her divine will, working through the invisible dimensions of the battle, through the psychic and spiritual forces that operate beneath the surface of the physical conflict. She strengthens some warriors and weakens others. She plants courage in one heart and terror in another. She tips the scales that determine the momentum of a battle, not through direct physical intervention, but through the subtle and irresistible application of a power that operates at the level where individual will meets cosmic necessity. This is not arbitrary. She does not choose the fallen by whim, though her choices can seem arbitrary and even cruel from a human perspective. She chooses according to a principle that is consistent with her nature as a sovereignty goddess. The warrior who has fulfilled his purpose, who has served the land to the limit of his capacity, and has given what was required of him, falls. The warrior whose time has not yet come, who still has something essential to give, survives. This is the profound and terrifying calculus of fate as the Morrigan administers it. Not justice in the human sense, not reward and punishment according to a moral ledger, but the deep and cosmic logic of a universe in which every life has a function, every death has a meaning, and the role of the divine is not to protect individuals from their fates, but to ensure that the great pattern of existence unfolds as it must. There is also a dimension of the Morrigan's relationship to the fallen dead that extends beyond the moment of death itself. The ancient Irish texts suggest that she is not merely the announcer and the selector of death, but in some sense its steward. The dead warriors who fall under her witness are not simply gone. They enter the great accounting of the land, the deep memory of the sovereignty goddess, whose substance is the earth in which they are buried. The field drinks the blood of the fallen and returns it to the land, and the land is the Morrigan, and nothing that is given to her is ever simply lost. This is not a comfortable version of immortality. It is not the paradise of the heroic tradition, the otherworldly banquet hall where warriors feast forever in the company of the divine. It is something more elemental and more absolute. The fallen are absorbed into the sovereign power of the land itself. They become part of the permanent substance of the place that produced them. And the Morrigan, as the living embodiment of that sovereign power, holds them all. The crow on the shoulder of the dying Cuchulainn is the culminating image of this role. It is the Morrigan bearing witness to the fulfillment of a fate that was set in motion long before the battle itself began. She does not take pleasure in his death, not in any emotional sense that a human being could recognize, but she is present for it. She authenticates it. She receives it into the vast and inhuman accounting system that she administers on behalf of the cosmos. And in doing so, she transforms what could be merely a death, a great warrior cut down by his enemies, into something of an entirely different order. She transforms it into myth. For centuries, the Morrigan held her place in the Irish mythological tradition with the terrifying dignity of an entity too powerful and too deeply embedded in the cultural memory to be easily displaced. But as the Irish world was transformed by the coming of Christianity, first gradually, and then with increasing momentum from the 5th century onward, the great supernatural figures of the pre-Christian tradition were subjected to a process of reinterpretation that ranged from the relatively benign to the actively hostile. The Christian monks who were responsible for writing down the old oral traditions occupied a position of fascinating and productive ambivalence. They were men of the new faith, committed to the theological framework of a universe governed by a single omnipotent God. But they were also men of the Irish land, products of a culture that was saturated with the old stories, the old figures, the old understanding of a world in which the supernatural was not a category of experience separate from the ordinary, but woven into the fabric of everyday reality. They could not simply erase the Tuatha De Danann and the great heroes of the mythological cycles. These were the stories of their people, the narrative foundation of an entire civilization's self-understanding, what they could do, and what the manuscripts preserve evidence of their doing was reshape the context in which those stories were told and understood. The Tuatha De Danann were rationalized, quietly demoted from the status of gods to the status of ancient kings and queens, powerful and mysterious figures of a distant heroic past, but no longer divine in the full theological sense. Their supernatural abilities were preserved in the storytelling, but reframed as a form of advanced human skill, a mastery of druidic arts that was extraordinary, but not, in principle, beyond the category of the human. This allowed the stories to be told without the telling, constituting an act of theological transgression. The Morrigan, however, presented a particular challenge. Her nature was too specifically and too explicitly supernatural to be easily rationalized into the category of a merely human figure. She appeared and disappeared at will. She transformed herself between forms. She prophesied deaths with absolute accuracy. She was present at cosmic events that had occurred before the beginning of recorded time. She was, in the most unavoidable sense, a goddess, and for a theology that admitted of only one divine being, that was a profound and irreducible problem. The solution adopted by the manuscripts is instructive. She is neither condemned outright as a demon, which would have required the stories about her to be actively suppressed rather than preserved, nor is she simply accepted as a deity, which would have constituted an unacceptable theological concession. Instead, she occupies a deeply ambiguous position in the written tradition, one in which her power is fully acknowledged, but its ultimate source and its ultimate moral valence are left carefully undefined. She is a supernatural being of vast and terrifying capability. Whether that capability derives from a divine or a diabolical source is not a question that the manuscripts press too hard. They preserve her. They fear her. They are not entirely sure what to do with her. But outside the relatively circumscribed world of the manuscript tradition, in the broader cultural landscape of medieval Europe, a figure that bore suggestive resemblances to the Morrigan underwent a very different transformation. The evolution of the character, known as Morgan Le Fay in the Arthurian tradition, is one of the most fascinating and contentious questions in the study of the Celtic supernatural. And while the precise nature of the connection between Morgan and the Morrigan is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate, the thematic and onomastic parallels are too significant to dismiss entirely. Morgan Le Fay, whose name in the French tradition contains the element fey, related to the fairy, and whose earliest Welsh and French appearances show her as a powerful, ambiguous supernatural woman, associated with sovereignty, healing, and the otherworld, shares with the Morrigan a set of characteristics that speak to a common deep cultural source, even if the direct genealogy remains uncertain. She is beautiful and powerful and morally ambiguous. She exists in a position of profound tension with the great male hero of her tradition, King Arthur, a tension that is simultaneously antagonistic and deeply entangled, as though the hero and the supernatural woman are bound together by a compact that neither fully understands. She is the embodiment of a power that the patriarchal order of the chivalric world cannot accommodate or control, and her ultimate role in the mythology, facilitating Arthur's passage to the otherworldly Isle of Avalon after his final battle, has the quality of the Morrigan's crow settling upon the shoulder of the dying Cu Chulainn. In the later development of the Arthurian tradition, Morgan Le Fay is progressively demonized and simplified. Where earlier accounts present her as a complex figure of mixed motivations, capable of both healing and harm, later versions transform her into something closer to a straightforward villainess, a scheming enchantress whose opposition to Arthur and to the values of his court is driven by simple malice. This trajectory mirrors the broader cultural process by which the great supernatural women of the Celtic tradition were diminished and demonized. As the medieval church's influence grew more pervasive and more hostile to the ambiguous and morally complex figures of the pre-Christian imagination, the same process that shrank the great and terrifying figures of the fairy tradition into winged nursery sprites was at work on the Morrigan and her counterparts throughout the Celtic world. The entities that had once embodied the full, terrible complexity of a cosmos in which power was amoral and fate was absolute were being forced into the dualistic framework of a theology that admitted only of angels and demons, saints and sinners, heroes and villains. The Morrigan, whose very nature resisted this simplification with every fiber of her mythological being, could not be straightforwardly tamed. But she could be misrepresented. She could be flattened. She could be reduced from the full, cosmic complexity of the Phantom Queen into a figure that the medieval imagination could more comfortably accommodate. And yet she survived, as she always has, as she apparently always will. The modern reimagining of the Morrigan is one of the most culturally significant and philosophically complex phenomena in contemporary spiritual and creative life. She has returned, not in the quiet, apologetic manner of a figure seeking rehabilitation, but with the full and unapologetic force of an entity that has always known her own value and has simply been waiting for the world to remember it. Her return has been mediated through several distinct cultural channels, each of which has contributed something different to the contemporary portrait. The first, and perhaps most foundational of these, is the academic revival of Celtic studies, the serious scholarly engagement with the Irish mythological texts that accelerated dramatically in the 19th and 20th centuries, producing translations and analyses of the ancient manuscripts that made the authentic, complex, and often deeply uncomfortable mythology of the Morrigan available to a general audience for the first time. These scholarly efforts stripped away centuries of Christian reinterpretation and Victorian sentimentalism to reveal the original figure in something approaching her mythological fullness. For readers who encountered the ancient texts without the protective cushioning of modern romantic interpretation, the effect was often startling. this was not the figure of popular fantasy. This was something older, stranger, and more demanding. A being whose power was not a source of comfort, but a challenge. A presence that required not admiration, but reckoning. From the world of fantasy literature, the Morrigan emerged refashioned, as she had been by Tolkien's work on the fairy tradition, into something closer to her authentic mythological stature. The elves of high fantasy were in many ways a reconstruction of the Tuatha De Danann and the great supernatural women of that tradition. The dangerous, beautiful, morally complex figures who stood at the intersection of human ambition and divine power were finding new expression in the heroines and antagonists of a literary tradition that was increasingly willing to honor the complexity of the old myths rather than sanitizing them into simple moral allegories. The Morrigan appears, recognizably if not always by name, in the work of writers who have taken the Celtic mythological tradition seriously as a creative resource. She appears in the shape of the battle goddess, who cannot be reduced to a simple category of good or evil. She appears as the beautiful and terrible woman who offers something of profound value to the hero and is refused. She appears as the crow above the field of the fallen. In each appearance, something of her authentic mythological power is preserved and transmitted to a new audience that is, in many cases, encountering the deep structure of the Celtic supernatural for the first time, but the most profound and the most personally significant dimension of the Morrigan's contemporary presence is found in the world of modern paganism and the emerging spiritualities of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Here, she has become not merely a character in a story, but an active and living spiritual presence, a divine entity who is approached for guidance, petitioned for protection, and honored through ritual practice by a growing community of practitioners who take seriously the possibility that the beings of the mythological tradition are not merely symbolic or metaphorical, but genuinely real in some dimension of experience that exceeds ordinary consciousness. The modern Morrigan devotee occupies a fascinating and often challenging spiritual position. She is not an easy deity to work with. Unlike the sanitized versions of divine femininity that populate much of contemporary spiritual commerce, the Morrigan, as she is encountered by serious practitioners of the Celtic tradition, does not offer comfort. She offers confrontation. She offers the stripping away of illusions, the forced reckoning with the truth of one's situation and one's nature. She offers, to those who are capable of receiving it, the same gift she offered Cu Chulainn, and that he refused: the gift of sovereignty, the gift of knowing oneself completely, without the protective distortions of pride and self-deception, and claiming one's power from that place of absolute clarity. Those who seek her do not do so because she is reassuring. They do so because they need what she has to offer. They need the capacity to face their own battles without illusion, to acknowledge the reality of endings without being destroyed by them, to stand in the presence of fate and accept its authority without losing the will to act. The Morrigan, in this context, becomes one of the most therapeutically and psychologically sophisticated figures in the entire landscape of contemporary spirituality, precisely because she makes no concessions to the very human desire for divine reassurance. She is the patron of the person who has stopped pretending that everything will be fine and has decided instead to become someone who can handle the truth that it might not be. She is the divine companion of the person who has looked at the worst possible outcomes clearly, who has made their peace with those outcomes, and who has decided to act anyway. She is the goddess of the warrior who knows they are going to die and fights with everything they have. She is the courage that exists not in the absence of fear, but in the full, clear-eyed acknowledgement of it. It is significant that she has become particularly resonant for women in contemporary spiritual practice. In a culture that has historically demanded that women embody the gentle, the nurturing, the accommodating, and the uncomplainingly sacrificial, the Morrigan's absolute refusal to be any of those things carries a particular charge. She is a figure of female power that requires no masculine validation and no softening for male comfort. She does not present herself as a protector of the vulnerable in the conventional maternal sense. She presents herself as the sovereign power of the land itself, a force that operates according to its own deep logic and its own ancient law, and that owes nothing to the preferences of anyone, male or female, mortal or divine. For women who have been told, in 1,000 explicit and implicit ways, that their worth is conditional upon their palatability, the Morrigan's example is not merely inspirational in the popular motivational sense. It is, for many, a genuine liberation. In this reading, her ancient relationship with Ku Chulainn takes on a new and deeply personal resonance for the modern practitioner. His refusal of her is not merely a mythological story about a hero's pride leading to his downfall. It becomes a mirror. It asks each person who engages with her mythology the same question she asked him. What are you refusing? What is the source of power that you are rejecting? Because accepting it would require you to admit something about yourself or your situation that you do not want to admit. What is the sovereignty you are declining? Because claiming it would demand too much of you. These are not comfortable questions, but they are for those who believe that mythology is not merely entertainment, but a living system of wisdom. Among the most important questions that any human being can confront, the Morrigan endures. She endures in the ancient manuscripts carefully preserved in libraries. She endures in the academic traditions of Celtic studies and comparative mythology. She endures in the creative output of fantasy literature and visual art and music and film. She endures in the practice of modern paganism and in the increasingly mainstream acknowledgement that the pre-Christian mythological traditions of Europe contain a profound and practically applicable wisdom that the modern world has not yet finished learning from. But why? Why does this particular figure, this ancient and terrifying and deeply uncomfortable embodiment of battle and fate and sovereignty and death, maintain such a powerful hold on the imagination? Why, in an age of unprecedented technological comfort, of a standard of material security that would have seemed magical to the Iron Age Irish who first told her stories, do we return again and again to an entity whose essential message is that death is real, that fate is inexorable, and that even the greatest of us will eventually fall? The first answer is rooted in the simple and inescapable fact that her message is true. In an age that has developed extraordinary capacities for avoiding, denying, and aestheticizing the reality of death and suffering, the Morrigan's refusal to participate in any such avoidance has the quality of a profound and necessary corrective. She does not let us forget what we are, what we face, and what the ultimate terms of human existence are. She is a figure of ruthless honesty in a cultural landscape that is saturated with consoling fictions. And there is a kind of deep, often uncomfortable relief in encountering a mythological figure who simply will not lie to you. There's also something powerfully important about her refusal to be categorized. The contemporary world has a powerful appetite for figures who embody clean and comprehensible value systems. We want our heroes to be unambiguously heroic. We want our divine figures to be unambiguously benevolent. We want the spiritual and the moral landscape to be organized in a way that tells us clearly what to aspire to and what to avoid. The Morrigan refuses all of this with the serene completeness of a force of nature. She is not good. She is not evil. She is sovereign. She is the land. She is what was here before the categories of good and evil were imposed upon the world. And she will be here after those categories have crumbled as surely as every kingdom and every civilization that has ever proclaimed itself the final and definitive understanding of how the world works. In this refusal to be categorized, she offers the modern imagination something of extraordinary value. She models a relationship with complexity, with moral ambiguity, and with the irreducible difficulty of existence that is not despair and is not nihilism, but is a form of profound and ancient wisdom. She says to each generation that encounters her, the world is not simple, and any system that tells you it has something to sell you. The truth is darker and stranger, and more beautiful than any simple system can contain. The crow circles above every field, not just the fields of your enemies. The sovereignty of the land does not negotiate. The ford runs on. The second answer has to do with the specific and powerful form that her honesty takes. She is not a simple messenger of doom. She is not the personification of despair or nihilism or the paralytic knowledge that nothing matters because all things end. She is something far more sophisticated and far more demanding. She is the figure that says yes, all things end, and in full and clear-eyed acknowledgement of that reality, you must act. you must fight. You must claim your sovereignty and exercise your power, and do the thing that is yours to do, even knowing that the crow will eventually settle on your shoulder too. This is not a comfortable message, but it is a sustaining one, and its power has not diminished with the passage of 2,000 years. The story of Cu Chulainn and the Morrigan is, when understood in its full mythological depth, not a story about a hero who was destroyed by a supernatural enemy. It is a story about the consequence of refusing one's fate with open eyes. Cu Chulainn is not destroyed by the Morrigan. He is revealed by her. The same process of stripping, testing, and ultimate exposure that she subjects him to is the process that makes him mythologically meaningful, that transforms a talented and dangerous young man into one of the defining figures of an entire civilization's self-understanding. She does not diminish him. She makes him, through the terrible instrument of his death, eternal. This is the final and most profound truth about the Morrigan. She is not the enemy of greatness. She is its necessary precondition. She is the darkness against which the light of heroism becomes visible. She is the finite against which the infinite capacity of human courage is measured. She is the crow that circles, the prophecy that waits, the sovereign truth of the land that cannot be refused forever. And in her presence, the heroes of every age are tested, stripped of their illusions, and ultimately revealed in their essential nature, for better or for worse. She is not a comfortable presence. She was never meant to be. She is the face of the world's oldest and most uncompromising truth, held in the form of a beautiful and terrible queen, looking up from the dark water of the ford, where she has always been washing, where she will always be washing, patient as the tide, and cold as iron, and permanent as the earth itself. The crow calls, the battle gathers, the ford runs dark. She is always there. At the end of this long journey through the darkest and deepest chambers of the Celtic mythological tradition, we find ourselves standing once again at the edge of the ford. The mist has not lifted. The washer is still there, working with that same slow and absolute patience at the boundary between the world of the living and the world of what lies beyond. And the question she poses to every generation that comes to her bank is the same question she posed to the great hero, whose story has been the heart of this telling. What will you do with the truth? Because the Morrigan has never offered anything else. Stripped of the Victorian sentimentalism that diminished the fairy, stripped of the Christian demonization that sought to contain her, stripped of the modern spiritual marketplace that would tame her into a comfortable patroness of female empowerment. What remains when all the layers of interpretation are peeled away is the same thing that has always been there, a figure of absolute and uncompromising honesty, standing at the threshold between human ambition and cosmic necessity, between the stories we tell ourselves about our invincibility and the raw truth of our condition. We need her because the truths she embodies have not become less true with the passage of time. The reality of death has not been negotiated away by technological progress. The existence of fate, in whatever form one chooses to understand that concept, the reality that we do not entirely control the outcomes of our actions and our choices, has not been disproved by the achievements of the rational age. The fact that sovereignty, in the most profound and personal sense of that term, is something that must be claimed and paid for and maintained, rather than simply assumed or granted, is as relevant to the modern individual as it was to the ancient Irish warrior. She endures because we have not yet solved the problems she represents. We have not yet found a satisfactory way to live with the knowledge of our own mortality that does not require either the comfort of a religious promise of immortality or the cold and ultimately unsatisfying assertion that death is simply nothing at all. We have not yet developed a cultural vocabulary adequate to the reality of fate and loss, and the terrible arbitrariness of a world that does not consistently reward the virtuous or protect the innocent. We have not yet reconciled ourselves to the truth that power, real power, the sovereignty that the Morrigan embodies and guards and offers to those worthy of it, is not gentle and is not comfortable and is not available without cost. She endures because she is necessary, not as a symbol to be invoked from a safe distance, not as an aesthetic to be adopted when it suits us, not as a patron whose protection we invoke without accepting the demands that her mythology so clearly and so insistently makes. She is necessary as a full and confrontational mythological presence, a figure that asks the hardest questions and refuses to pretend that the answers are simple or that the asking of them is optional. She endures too because the land endures. The ancient Irish understood something that we are only now, in our era of ecological crisis and environmental catastrophe, beginning to relearn. The land is not a background. It is not a resource. It is not a passive canvas upon which human stories unfold. It is a living, sovereign entity with its own laws and its own demands. The Morrigan is the face of those laws. She is the consciousness of the land made manifest in a form that human beings can, with great difficulty, and at the cost of all their comfortable illusions, begin to comprehend. When we speak of the Morrigan in the context of contemporary spirituality, we are not only speaking of an individual deity with an individual mythology. We are speaking of the whole vast and terrifying and beautiful project of being in right relationship with the world that sustains us. And that project has never been more urgent. The old compact that Cuchulainn refused is the same compact that industrial civilization has been refusing for 3 centuries. The sovereignty of the land has been dismissed. The Morrigan has been laughed at, ignored, reduced to a decorative figure on a fantasy novel cover, and the land, with the patient, terrible certainty of an entity that has been here long before us and will be here long after, is beginning to make the same statement about the consequences of that refusal that she made to the greatest hero Ireland ever produced. She does not threaten. She does not bargain. She simply continues doing what she has always done, washing at the ford, circling above the field, waiting with the endless patience of a power that is not subject to the urgencies of human time. The crow calls, the battle gathers, the ford runs dark. She is always there, and the invitation that she extends, now as she has always extended it, to every human being who stands at the edge of their own ford and looks across the dark water to the field beyond, is the same invitation she extended to Cu Chulainn in the moment before his greatest test. Accept the sovereignty. Accept the truth. Turn and face what is coming with open eyes and a clear heart, and the willingness to be exactly and entirely who you are, regardless of the cost. It is the only offer she has ever made. It is the only one that has ever mattered